The Caldwell plantation lay quiet in the early mornings, before the sun rose high enough to touch the upper gallery of the house. The land rolled gently, not steep enough to trouble a horse, not flat enough to give ease to those who worked it. Cotton stretched outward in long, narrow rows that disappeared into a thin line of trees at the edge of the property. Dew clung to the plants in the colder months, soaking the hems of skirts and the cuffs of trousers before the day's labor had properly begun. Silence in those hours was not peace, but a holding of breath before motion resumed. The main house stood apart from the rest of the property, lifted on a low rise that gave it distance and command. White columns supported the front porch, their paint renewed often enough to keep the appearance of order. The windows were tall and evenly spaced, their glass reflecting the sky. From the front steps one could see much of the land, though not the quarters. Those were set farther back, half a mile away, beyond a stand of oak and pine that broke the view and muffled sound. This separation was deliberate, an arrangement meant to preserve the quiet of the house and to remind those who lived there of their place. Thomas Caldwell rose early as he had for years. He dressed without haste, the habits of long practice guiding his hands. His hair had gone thin and gray, though he was not yet old by the measure of men in his position. He ate a simple breakfast, often alone, and read what correspondence had arrived by courier or post. His days were shaped by routine: meetings with the overseer, reviews of accounts, short rides through the fields to inspect the work. He spoke little, and when he did his words were measured. He was known among his neighbors as a man of discipline, not given to indulgence, proud of what he had built and careful to protect it. His daughters lived under that same discipline. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell occupied adjoining rooms on the second floor, their windows facing east toward the fields. They rose when the household stirred, dressed with the assistance of servants, and descended for breakfast at the appointed hour. Their movements were orderly, their speech polite. They had been raised to embody the expectations of their class, to move through the world without causing disturbance. Their identical appearance often drew comment from visitors, though within the house it was simply accepted as another fact, like the shape of the land or the turn of the seasons. They were alike enough to confuse those who did not know them well. Both were tall for women, with straight posture and careful manners. A small mark above the right eyebrow distinguished each face in the same place, a detail noted often in later years but rarely remarked upon then. Their voices differed slightly, Catherine's carrying more quickly, Elizabeth's lower and more reserved. Their habits, too, were not the same, though these differences were subtle and easily overlooked. The twins had passed the age at which most young women of their standing were married. This was remarked upon in the county, though never openly. Thomas Caldwell did not explain his reasons, and no one pressed him. It was assumed that suitable arrangements would be made in time, as they always were. Until then, the daughters remained at home, their days filled with lessons, sewing, reading, and the management of household concerns delegated to them. They supervised meals, oversaw linens, and attended to the smaller duties expected of them, all under the watchful presence of their father and the long-serving staff of the house. Margaret Sullivan had kept house for the Caldwells since before the twins were born. She moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, her steps light despite her age. She knew the rhythms of the household as well as she knew her own breathing. She spoke little unless spoken to, but she observed everything. It was her task to see that meals were prepared, rooms kept, and servants instructed. She maintained order without raising her voice, relying instead on expectation and habit. Beyond the house, life followed a different pattern. The enslaved people rose before dawn, their days beginning in darkness. They gathered tools, took what food was allotted to them, and moved into the fields or toward their assigned work. There was little conversation in the early hours. Fatigue and resignation shaped their movements. The overseer, James Whittaker, made his rounds on horseback, noting absences and delays. He carried a ledger in which names and tasks were recorded, marks made beside those who failed to meet expectation. The quarters were built of rough wood, their walls thin against wind and cold. Smoke from cooking fires drifted low in the evenings, settling among the trees. Children played when they could, their laughter brief and often cut short by calls to return inside. Illness moved quickly in those close spaces, and care was limited. Death was not uncommon, though it was rarely marked beyond a brief entry in a record book and the redistribution of labor. Samuel and Elijah lived among the others, indistinguishable in dress and duty. Both were young men, strong from work, quiet in manner. They had been purchased together some years before, brought from another state when their previous owners' fortunes failed. On arrival, they learned quickly what was expected of them. They kept their heads down, did their work, and spoke only when necessary. What set them apart was not visible, and for a time it remained hidden. The days on the plantation passed with little variation. Morning gave way to afternoon, afternoon to evening. Bells marked meals and work shifts. Seasons changed, bringing heat that pressed down upon the fields and cold that cut through thin clothing. The house remained orderly, the quarters crowded. Authority flowed in one direction, and resistance, when it existed, took quieter forms. Elizabeth and Catherine moved through this world as they had been taught. They read aloud in the afternoons, practiced their needlework, and took supervised walks on the grounds. They were not expected to venture near the quarters, and usually they did not. The distance between the house and those structures was physical and reinforced by custom. When the twins did encounter enslaved people, it was in the context of service, brief and impersonal. Yet the plantation was not as sealed as it appeared. Sounds traveled on the air and people noticed more than they were meant to. In the evenings, when work was done and the light faded, the house grew quiet. Lamps were lit, conversations lowered. Outside, life continued in the quarters, though the house did not acknowledge it. It was during this routine, unremarkable time that small deviations began to occur. Catherine lingered longer than usual on her walks. Elizabeth asked questions about tasks she had never shown interest in before. These changes were subtle, easy to dismiss. Thomas Caldwell noticed little beyond the accounts and the weather. Margaret Sullivan noticed more, though she did not speak of it. Winter approached with an early cold that year. Frost settled on the fields before it was expected, damaging some of the cotton still waiting to be gathered. Roads became difficult, travel slowed, and the plantation turned inward. Isolation deepened. Fires burned longer in the house and blankets were brought out of storage. In the quarters, the cold was sharper, the nights longer. The twins spent more time indoors, their movements constrained by weather and expectation. They read more, talked quietly between themselves. Their faces showed signs of strain that Margaret Sullivan could not recall seeing before. Elizabeth grew more withdrawn, her attention often fixed on nothing in particular. Catherine, by contrast, seemed restless, her energy unfocused. Samuel's reassignment to the stables came later, but even before that, his presence on the edges of the house increased. Horses required care regardless of season, and the stables were closer to the main building than the fields. Elijah continued his work in the gardens, tending what little could be tended in the cold months, repairing fences, clearing debris. These tasks brought him nearer to the paths the twins used, though still at a distance. No one spoke openly of these proximities. The structure of plantation life depended on what was seen and what was ignored. The Caldwells' authority rested on the assumption that boundaries would hold without constant reinforcement. For years they had. In the evenings, when the house settled into silence, Elizabeth and Catherine sometimes remained awake, listening to the wind move through the trees. They shared a room often, despite having separate chambers, a habit from childhood that had never entirely faded. In those hours, they spoke in low voices about matters they did not discuss during the day. Their words were careful, their pauses long. Outside, the quarters quieted as well. Fires burned low and people lay down to rest. The land held its breath under frost and cloud. Routine persisted, but beneath it something had begun to shift, unnoticed by most, unrecorded in any ledger. The plantation continued to function as it always had. Cotton was gathered when weather allowed. Meals were served. Orders were given and obeyed, yet the stillness of that winter carried a weight that would later be recognized as warning. At the time, it passed as nothing more than the season's burden, another year moving forward as it always had, toward an end no one yet understood. The first clear change in the order of the Caldwell plantation did not arrive with noise or open conflict. It came quietly, through small decisions made without announcement, through looks exchanged and duties reassigned. In later years, those who studied the surviving records would note that nothing in them marked this period as unusual. The ledgers continued in the same careful hand. Names were written, rations listed, cotton weighed. Yet within the daily movement of people and labor, a different pressure began to make itself felt. James Whittaker had served as overseer for several years and understood the expectations placed upon him. He was charged with maintaining output, discipline, and silence. He did not concern himself with the inner lives of those he managed. His attention was fixed on efficiency and obedience. Any deviation from routine was, in his view, a threat to order. During the winter months, Whittaker began to notice small irregularities. Samuel was late to the fields more than once before his reassignment, arriving breathless and offering explanations that were thin but not openly defiant. Elijah lingered in the gardens beyond what was necessary, sometimes stopping work altogether to stand and watch the house. These actions, taken alone, would not have drawn notice. Taken together, they suggested distraction. Whittaker addressed these matters in the way he always did, with warnings delivered in clipped tones. He did not yet resort to punishment. He believed correction could be achieved through observation and pressure. Still, he made note of the behavior and increased his attention. At the house, Thomas Caldwell's authority remained unquestioned, but his focus had narrowed. The winter's damage to the cotton crop troubled him more than he admitted. He spent longer hours reviewing accounts, calculating losses and projected gains. The tension of these calculations weighed on him, and he grew less attentive to the subtle shifts within his household. Elizabeth and Catherine felt that absence keenly. Their father's authority was constant, but his presence was not. Meals were taken with little conversation. Instructions were given through Margaret Sullivan rather than directly. This created space, small at first but real. It was in this space that Catherine's discovery occurred. The stable was a place she had rarely visited and never alone. Horses were valuable, but they were also associated with work, with men and labor, not with the refined domestic sphere she was expected to inhabit. Yet one evening, near the end of autumn, she walked farther than usual, following a path that curved toward the outbuildings. The light was fatting and the air held the smell of hay and animal sweat. She intended to turn back before being seen, but a sound caught her attention. It was not the movement of a horse but the soft rustle of paper. She paused, then stepped closer. Samuel sat on an overturned crate, a folded newspaper in his hands. His posture was intent, his lips moving slightly as his eyes followed the lines. He did not see her at first. When he did, he stood abruptly, the paper crumpling in his grip. For a moment, neither spoke. The act she had witnessed was forbidden, but the meaning of that act took time to register. Literacy among enslaved people was not simply discouraged. It was illegal, regarded as a threat to the entire system that supported the plantation economy. To report what she had seen would have been expected. To fail to do so was itself a breach of order. Catherine did not report it. She did not speak at all, but turned and left the stable without a word. The silence of that exchange lingered. Samuel waited for consequences that did not immediately arrive. Each day that passed without punishment deepened his awareness that something had shifted, though he did not yet understand what. Catherine's behavior changed after that evening. She became distracted, her attention wandering during lessons and household tasks. Margaret Sullivan noticed the change and grew uneasy. She had seen enough of life to know that deviation in young women of Catherine's station rarely ended without cost. Elizabeth observed her sister closely. The twins had always shared an understanding that did not require explanation. Catherine's agitation was plain to her. When pressed, Catherine spoke only in fragments, referring to something she had seen, something she could not forget. Elizabeth listened without interruption. The injustice of the system in which they lived was not new to either sister. They had been raised within it, taught to accept its logic and its limits. Enslaved people were present in every aspect of their lives, yet were rendered invisible as individuals. What Catherine had seen in the stable disrupted that abstraction. It presented a man engaged in thought, in private intellectual labor, an activity reserved by custom and law for people like herself. Elizabeth did not go to the stable. She did not need to. The image Catherine described was enough. It unsettled her in a way she could not immediately articulate. She had been taught that order depended on clear distinctions. The sight of those distinctions breaking down, even in secret, suggested instability. Meanwhile, Whittaker's scrutiny increased. He reassigned Samuel to work closer to the house, citing the need for additional help in the stables during the winter. On paper, this was a neutral decision. In practice, it placed Samuel under greater observation and brought him into closer proximity with the family. This reassignment was the first formal action that altered the balance of power in a visible way. It was not intended as punishment, but as control. Whittaker believed that by narrowing Samuel's movements, he could prevent further irregularities. He did not consider the unintended consequences of proximity. Elijah's work in the gardens brought him into view as well. The cold limited what could be grown, but maintenance continued. Paths were cleared, fences repaired. Elizabeth passed him on her walks, their interactions brief and formal. Over time, these encounters accumulated. A nod became a pause. A pause became an exchange of words that went beyond instruction. These moments were small and easily overlooked. No one spoke openly. No rules were broken in a way that demanded immediate response. Yet the underlying injustice of the system began to press more heavily on those involved. For Samuel and Elijah, the awareness that they were being watched grew sharper. They understood that deviation invited punishment. Yet they also sensed something else, a loosening in the rigid expectations that had governed their lives since arrival. Catherine's silence after the stable incident was not neutral. It was an act, however unintentional, of withholding the system's corrective force. Catherine herself struggled with that decision. She recorded nothing, spoke only to Elizabeth, and carried the weight alone. The knowledge that she had chosen not to enforce the law troubled her sense of self. She had been raised to believe in order and obedience. Now she found herself complicit in disobedience, though she did not yet name it as such. Elizabeth's response was quieter. She did not dwell on the injustice in abstract terms. Instead, she began to observe more closely. She watched how orders were given, how compliance was expected without question, how punishment hovered as an unspoken threat. These observations did not lead her to immediate action, but they altered her understanding of the world she inhabited. Thomas Caldwell remained largely unaware of these shifts. His concerns were directed elsewhere. When he did notice changes in his daughter's demeanor, he attributed them to the season, to the isolation imposed by winter. He mentioned it once in a letter to his brother, framing it as a matter of temperament rather than circumstance. The first overt sign of authority behaving unfairly came not in response to the twins, but in the quarters. A man accused of slowing work was punished publicly, made an example of to discourage others. The punishment was not unusual by the standards of the time, but its timing and severity unsettled those who witnessed it. Fear spread quietly, reinforcing the boundaries that were beginning, in subtle ways, to blur. Elizabeth heard of the incident through fragments of conversation, half-finished sentences exchanged among servants. She did not witness it directly, but the knowledge weighed on her. It underscored the cost of deviation, the stakes involved in even the smallest act of resistance or noncompliance. Catherine felt the fear more directly. She began to avoid certain areas of the plantation, limiting her movements even as her curiosity grew. The tension between fear and fascination shaped her days, leaving her restless and distracted. By the time winter fully set in, the plantation existed in a state of quiet strain. Authority asserted itself more sharply in some places, loosened unexpectedly in others. The injustice that had always underpinned the system became more visible, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of small, unsettling moments. No one yet spoke of escape or rebellion. Such ideas remained unformed, unspoken. What existed instead was a growing awareness that the order governing their lives was neither natural nor immutable. This awareness did not bring clarity or resolve. It brought unease, and with it, the first stirrings of fear that something irreversible had begun. By the time winter reached its deepest point, the routines of the Caldwell plantation had grown tighter rather than looser. What had begun as minor adjustments hardened into deliberate control. James Whittaker increased his presence across the property, riding the boundaries more often, stopping to question men at work, standing longer than necessary in the stables and near the gardens. His vigilance was not born of certainty, but of suspicion, a sense that something had shifted beyond his understanding. Rules that had long existed without frequent enforcement were restated aloud. Work hours were extended when weather permitted. Evening movement was restricted more sharply. The enslaved were reminded, through tone and posture as much as words, that observation was constant. Fear did not erupt, it settled. It entered the body as habit, shaping posture and speech. Samuel understood this change immediately. The reassignment that had brought him closer to the house now placed him in greater danger. Every task in the stables was performed under the assumption that eyes were upon him, even when none were visible. He limited his speech, avoided unnecessary contact, and hid what little writing material he possessed more carefully than before. The newspaper that Catherine had seen was burned, page by page, behind the stables on a night when smoke could be mistaken for warmth against the cold. Elijah felt the tightening differently. His work in the gardens was solitary by nature, and the increased scrutiny came in the form of questions rather than presence. Whittaker asked him where he had been, how long tasks took, why certain repairs were delayed. Each answer was weighed, each pause noted. Elijah learned to measure his words, to anticipate suspicion. For Elizabeth and Catherine, the pressure manifested in expectations that narrowed their already limited choices. Their father's attention returned to them, not gently, but with purpose. The winter losses to the crop and the general uncertainty of the season prompted him to think more seriously about the future of his household. Stability, in his view, required decisive action. Meals grew more formal. Conversation shifted toward alliances, neighboring families, and the advantages of connection. Elizabeth listened in silence, her posture composed, her thoughts elsewhere. Catherine struggled more openly, her responses occasionally delayed, her focus unsteady. Thomas Caldwell noticed these differences and grew concerned, though he did not yet interpret them as defiance. Margaret Sullivan watched these interactions with unease. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs of decisions being made without consultation. She also observed the increased movement of the twins toward the edges of their prescribed world. Catherine lingered near the windows that faced the distant trees. Elizabeth asked questions about matters that had once seemed settled. The injustice embedded in the plantation structure pressed inward from all sides. Enslaved people bore the immediate weight of it, through longer hours and harsher discipline. The twins felt it as confinement, as the narrowing of paths already limited by birth and gender. Their experiences were not equivalent, but they intersected in ways that became harder to ignore. Conversations between Elizabeth and Catherine grew more frequent and more guarded. They spoke at night in low voices, their words chosen carefully. What began as shared observation turned slowly into shared reckoning. They did not speak of love or escape. They spoke instead of fairness, of law, of the difference between what was permitted and what was right. These discussions did not resolve anything. They sharpened the tension. Samuel and Catherine spoke rarely and briefly, always within sight of others. Their exchanges were formal, constrained by circumstance. Yet even these limited interactions carried weight. Catherine's questions about the stables, about horses and supplies, were practical on the surface, but beneath them lay a growing recognition of Samuel's intellect and restraint. He answered carefully, aware that any misstep could bring consequences not only for himself but for others. Elizabeth's interactions with Elijah followed a similar pattern. She observed his work, asked about repairs, commented on the state of the grounds. Elijah responded with respect and distance. Both were aware of the imbalance that defined their exchange. Neither named it aloud. The pressure of secrecy intensified as winter wore on. Silence became a burden rather than a shield. Each person involved carried knowledge that could not be shared without risk. The plantation itself seemed to close in, its routines repeating with mechanical insistence, its authority asserting itself through repetition rather than force. Thomas Caldwell's concerns crystallized into action as the season began to turn. He corresponded with neighboring families, discussing arrangements that would secure alliances and restore a sense of order. These letters were written in his careful hand, their tone practical and assured. He did not consult his daughters. Consultation was not expected. When he announced his intentions at the dinner table, the effect was immediate. The names he spoke were familiar, the arrangements conventional. Elizabeth and Catherine listened without interruption, their faces composed. The weight of the decision settled over them, heavy and inescapable. For Catherine, the announcement felt like closure rather than beginning. The narrow paths she had sensed were now clearly marked. The injustice she had observed from a distance pressed directly upon her own life. Elizabeth experienced the moment differently, with a quiet clarity that surprised her. The future laid out before them was orderly, secure, and intolerable. Beyond the house, word of the announcement filtered through the servants in fragments. It meant little to most, another sign of continuity. For Samuel and Elijah, it altered the stakes. Whatever unspoken understanding had existed now faced an external force, formal and irreversible. The days that followed were marked by restraint. No one spoke openly of what lay ahead. Work continued. Meals were taken. Yet beneath the surface, options narrowed. Authority had drawn its line, and the cost of crossing it became unmistakable. Fear did not erupt into panic. It settled into resolve, uneven and unspoken. The pressure that had been building now had direction. Something would have to give, though no one yet knew how or when. The days following Thomas Caldwell's announcement passed with an unnatural calm. The house did not change its rhythms. Meals were served at the same hours. Lamps were lit at dusk. Servants moved quietly through halls they knew by heart. Yet the stillness carried a different weight, one that pressed inward rather than settling outward. Decisions had been made, and though no one spoke of them again, their presence was felt in every room. Elizabeth and Catherine did not protest. They had been raised to understand that protest served no purpose in such matters. Compliance was assumed, and silence was taken as agreement. Their outward composure was remarked upon by Margaret Sullivan, who noted the absence of tears or argument. To her, this restraint seemed unnatural, though she did not voice the thought. In private, the sisters spoke little at first. The announcement had clarified what had previously been uncertain. What remained was not discussion, but reckoning. The narrowness of their future was no longer theoretical. It had shape and names and an expected date. The injustice they had observed from a distance had now entered their own lives fully formed. For Samuel and Elijah, the announcement was learned indirectly, through fragments carried by servants and overheard remarks. The information arrived without context or explanation, but its meaning was clear enough. Whatever fragile space had existed was closing. The authority that governed the plantation had moved from observation to action. It was during this period that the final decision took shape. though no single moment marked its arrival. Instead, it emerged through a series of quiet acknowledgments. Elizabeth and Catherine began to speak more plainly to one another, abandoning the cautious abstractions that had characterized their earlier conversations. They did not frame their situation in terms of romance or fulfillment. They spoke of inevitability, of choice narrowed to its last edge. Catherine's diary, later recovered, would describe this period in sparse language. She wrote of nights spent awake, listening to the house settle, of mornings that arrived too quickly. She recorded no plans, only the recognition that compliance would require a kind of death she could not accept. Elizabeth, less inclined to write, expressed her resolve through action. She began to observe the household more closely, noting routines and absences. She asked practical questions about supplies, about travel, about the timing of patrols. These inquiries were framed as curiosity, but they carried intention. Samuel and Elijah were drawn into this shifting gravity gradually. Conversations remained limited, but meaning passed through them nonetheless. A glance held longer than necessary. A phrase carried double weight. Each understood the risk of misinterpretation, yet each recognized the narrowing of time. The winter had begun to loosen its hold, though cold still lingered in the mornings. Roads softened, becoming passable again. With this change came increased movement beyond the plantation. Couriers arrived more frequently. Neighbors visited. The sense of isolation that had protected secrecy began to erode. James Whittaker's vigilance sharpened in response. He increased evening patrols and questioned servants more aggressively. His suspicion lacked a clear object, which made it more dangerous. Uncertainty bred excess. Punishments became quicker, explanations unnecessary. It was under these conditions that the line was crossed. On the night of March 17th, the house retired as usual. Lamps were extinguished one by one. The twins' rooms fell dark. Margaret Sullivan noted nothing amiss when she made her final round. Outside, the air was still, the moon absent. Darkness pressed close, offering concealment. Elizabeth moved first. She dressed plainly, choosing garments that would not draw attention in low light. Catherine followed, carrying only what could be concealed beneath her shawl. They moved through the house without speaking, guided by familiarity rather than sight. Each creak of the floorboards was anticipated, each pause measured. Beyond the house, Samuel and Elijah waited. They had prepared quietly, over weeks of observation and restraint. Supplies had been gathered in small amounts, hidden and redistributed. Routes had been discussed without nomming them. The plan, such as it was, relied on timing and silence rather than certainty. The fire was set not with malice but with purpose. Elizabeth lit it in a storage building near the quarters, choosing a place where it would be seen quickly but burn slowly. The intent was not destruction but diversion. Smoke rose, thin at first, then thicker, drawing attention outward. The alarm spread as expected. Shouts cut through the night. Feet pounded the ground. Buckets were brought, lines formed. In the confusion, the absence of 4 individuals went unnoticed. By the time the fire was contained, the realization came too late. The house was searched, then the grounds. Names were called. Lanterns swept the darkness. The narrative formed quickly and without evidence. Samuel and Elijah had escaped. The twins had been taken. This conclusion served the needs of authority. It preserved the assumption of control and absolved those left behind of deeper scrutiny. Search parties were organized. Neighbors alerted. Rewards offered. Thomas Caldwell learned of the fire and the disappearance in the early hours of the morning. His response was immediate and unrestrained. He directed the search personally, his voice sharp with urgency. He did not yet question the story that had been offered to him. It aligned too closely with expectation. As the days passed and the search widened, the line crossed that night hardened into consequence. There would be no quiet return, no explanation that could restore what had been disrupted. The act of leaving, of choosing absence over compliance, could not be undone. Those who remained on the plantation felt the change acutely. Fear intensified, sharpened by uncertainty. The injustice that had underpinned daily life now expressed itself through suspicion and punishment. Silence became absolute. Elizabeth, Catherine, Samuel, and Elijah moved northward under cover of that silence, carrying with them the full weight of what they had crossed. Behind them, the plantation closed ranks, its authority reasserting itself through pursuit and denial. The line had been crossed. What followed would unfold beyond the reach of the land they left behind, but its consequences would remain, shaping memory, record, and silence for years to come. The movement north was not marked by speed, but by caution. Days passed measured not by distance but by concealment. Travel occurred in fragments, short stretches undertaken at night, followed by long hours of stillness. The four learned quickly that survival depended less on motion than on restraint. To be unseen was more valuable than to be far away. Samuel took the lead when direction was required. His familiarity with horses, roads, and the habits of patrols guided their choices. He did not speak of courage or resolve. He spoke instead of timing, of cover, of the need to wait until sound and movement settled before proceeding. Catherine listened closely, committing details to memory. Elizabeth observed, absorbing the discipline required to remain silent even when fear pressed close. Elijah carried little beyond what was necessary. He watched the edges of the road, the shape of trees against the sky, the posture of men they passed at a distance. His awareness was constant, sharpened by years of labor under scrutiny. He understood how easily suspicion could be aroused, how quickly a glance could become accusation. During the day they hid. Barns, thickets, abandoned sheds offered temporary shelter. Food was rationed carefully. Water was taken when it could be done without risk. Conversation was limited to what was essential. In those hours of waiting, the reality of their choice settled fully upon them. Elizabeth used that time to remember. She fixed details in her mind, not for sentiment but for record. The sound of the wind through bare branches, the weight of damp ground beneath her hands, the way fear altered her breathing, making each inhale deliberate. She did not frame these memories as testimony, but they became that nonetheless, a private accounting of what had been endured. Catherine's resistance took a different form. She carried a small notebook, concealed beneath her clothing, and when circumstances allowed, she wrote. The entries were brief and factual. Locations were described without names. Dates were noted only by reference to weather or moon. She did not write of emotion unless it affected judgment. The act of writing itself was an assertion of control, a refusal to let experience pass unmarked. Samuel watched her do this once and said nothing. He understood the danger of written words, but he also understood the need to preserve truth. His own resistance had long taken the form of memory, of holding knowledge quietly until it could be used. Catherine's record was another kind of holding. As they moved farther from Georgia, the immediate threat of capture shifted, but it did not recede. Patrols were less frequent, but suspicion remained. Every encounter carried risk. They learned to present themselves as travelers of limited means, moving for work or family obligation. Elizabeth and Catherine altered their speech, softening the markers of their upbringing. Samuel and Elijah adjusted their posture, balancing deference with confidence. Assistance came rarely and without ceremony. When it did, it was offered quietly without explanation. A meal left where it could be found. Directions given in a low voice. A place to rest for a single night. No names were exchanged. Gratitude was implied, not spoken. Weeks passed in this manner. The landscape changed gradually, fields giving way to towns, roads widening. The air carrying different sounds. With each mile, the plantation receded, though its influence remained. The habits formed under authority did not vanish with distance. They lingered in posture, in expectation, in the instinct to remain unseen. It was during one of these pauses, hidden in the loft of a disused barn, that Elizabeth spoke of the plantation for the first time since their departure. She did not speak of loss or longing. She spoke of structure, of how silence had been enforced, how narratives were shaped by those who remained. She recognized that what they had done would be recorded by others, framed to serve purposes not their own. This recognition shaped her quiet resistance. She began to consider not only survival but memory. If they were to live, it would be under new names, new arrangements. Yet the truth of their choice, the nature of their departure, risked being buried beneath accusation and assumption. Elizabeth resolved, without stating it aloud, to remember precisely what had occurred, to hold it intact against distortion. Catherine's writing took on greater purpose after that conversation. She began to note not only their movements but the conditions that made those movements necessary. She described the narrowing of options, the authority that left no space for dissent. These entries were not intended for publication. They were meant to exist, to counter the silence imposed by power. Samuel's resistance was quieter still. He measured their progress not in miles but in safety. He made decisions that favored caution over speed, even when impatience pressed against him. He carried with him the knowledge of those left behind, family members still bound to the system they had escaped. This knowledge tempered any sense of relief. Freedom, when it came, would be incomplete. Elijah, too, bore memory as resistance. He recalled the faces of those who would be punished in their absence, the tightening of control that would follow. He did not speak of this often, but it shaped his resolve. The injustice they had left behind was not abstract. It had names and consequences. When they finally reached a place where movement slowed and concealment became less urgent, the change was subtle. There was no clear boundary marking safety. Instead, there was a gradual easing, a sense that pursuit was no longer immediate. They did not announce this to one another. They simply rested longer, spoke more freely, breathed more deeply. In this relative stillness, the work of quiet resistance continued. New names were chosen, not as erasure but as necessity. Elizabeth and Catherine practiced using them until they came without hesitation. Samuel and Elijah did the same. Each name carried risk, but also protection. They did not celebrate their survival. Celebration implied completion, and nothing was complete. What they had done could not be undone, and what lay ahead remained uncertain. Their resistance was not loud or declarative. It existed in the act of continuing, of recording, of remembering. Far to the south, the Caldwell plantation tightened its narrative, shaping absence into accusation. Here, in the slow accumulation of days and nights beyond its reach, a different record was being kept. It was incomplete, fragile, and hidden, but it existed. In that existence lay a form of resistance that authority could not fully erase. In the weeks following the disappearance, the Caldwell plantation became a place governed less by routine than by explanation. What had occurred could not be left unframed. Absence demanded interpretation, and interpretation, if left unclaimed, risked disorder. Authority moved quickly to define the event, not through investigation, but through declaration. James Whittaker's account was the first to take shape. He recorded the fire, the confusion, the discovery that Samuel and Elijah were missing, and the assumption that followed. His language was firm and unqualified. The enslaved men had fled. The daughters had been taken. This version required no further inquiry. It preserved the expected hierarchy and assigned guilt in a direction that aligned with existing belief. Thomas Caldwell accepted this account without pause. The alternative was unthinkable, not because it lacked plausibility, but because it threatened the foundation upon which his life had been built. To consider that his daughters had acted with intention, that they had rejected both him and the system he represented, would have required a reckoning he was unprepared to face. Search parties were organized and expanded. Notices were sent to neighboring counties. Riders followed roads and river crossings, questioning travelers, inspecting wagons. Rewards were posted, their language careful to emphasize recovery rather than punishment, though the latter was understood. The effort was substantial, not because success was expected, but because failure could not be acknowledged. Within the plantation, discipline hardened. Those enslaved were questioned repeatedly, often without clear purpose. Silence was interpreted as complicity. Punishments were administered not for proven acts, but for the possibility of knowledge withheld. Fear became a tool, applied broadly and without precision. Margaret Sullivan observed these changes with growing unease. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a narrative being enforced. Questions were asked not to discover truth, but to confirm what had already been decided. She spoke little, offering only what was required. Her earlier letter to her sister remained hidden, its observations now too dangerous to repeat. Thomas Caldwell's grief did not soften his resolve. It sharpened it. He slept little, ate less, and spoke often of recovery. The idea that his daughters might be dead was easier to bear than the suggestion that they had chosen to leave. Death preserved innocence. Choice implied judgment. When the search yielded nothing, its failure was attributed to cunning and outside assistance. The possibility that the narrative itself was flawed was not entertained. Instead, the scope of the search widened, its purpose shifting subtly from rescue to confirmation of loss. It was during this period that Thomas Caldwell's health began to fail. The strain of sustained anger and exhaustion took its toll. He took to his bed more frequently, attended by a physician who spoke in careful terms. Letters went unanswered. Decisions were delayed, then delegated. The letter that arrived in early May was not read aloud. Its contents were known only to Thomas Caldwell and later to his brother Edward. Whatever it contained, its effect was immediate and severe. Thomas's rage, described by those present as sudden and consuming, left him weakened. He did not recover. His death was recorded with the formality appropriate to his station. The cause was listed in the language of the time, vague and sufficient. Mourning followed prescribed patterns. Black cloth was hung. Visitors arrived. The search for the twins ceased quietly, its failure folded into the larger narrative of tragedy. Edward Caldwell assumed control of the estate with efficiency. He was a man accustomed to order, less emotionally invested in the daily life of the plantation. His first actions were administrative. He reviewed accounts, assessed damage, and evaluated the labor force. He did not question the official story, though he examined it more closely than his brother had. It was during this review that Edward discovered the wooden box in Thomas's study. Its contents contradicted everything that had been declared publicly. The certificates, crude and unsigned by any recognized authority, recorded a different account. The accompanying letter, written in Catherine's hand, offered explanation without apology. Edward read these documents in silence. He did not summon witnesses or seek counsel immediately. He understood the implications too well. To acknowledge the truth would not only stain the family name, but unravel the authority upon which the plantation and others like it depended. The injustice revealed by the documents was not isolated. It was systemic. His decision was made without ceremony. The box was closed and returned to its place. The documents were not destroyed, but they were removed from circulation, denied the status of evidence. The official narrative remained unchanged. Publicly, Edward reinforced the story of abduction. He spoke of loss and outrage. Privately, he worked to ensure that no alternative account gained traction. Servants were dismissed or reassigned. Records were reviewed and adjusted. Silence was maintained through implication rather than threat. Institutional denial did not require constant effort. It relied on alignment between interest and belief. The community accepted the story because it fit what was expected. To question, it would have required acknowledging the possibility of choice, where obedience was assumed. Years passed. The plantation continued under reduced circumstances. The absence of the twins became part of local memory, shaped by repetition and distance. Details blurred, assumptions hardened. The truth existed only in fragments, held by those who had reason to conceal it. Institutional denial did not erase reality. It buried it beneath layers of authority and time, rendering it inaccessible to all but those who knew where to look. Time altered the Caldwell plantation without restoring it. Fields were worked less intensively. Buildings aged without repair. Authority remained, but it was thinner, more dependent on habit than confidence. The official account of the twins' disappearance settled into local understanding, repeated without scrutiny, its edges smoothed by years of retelling. What had once been urgent became merely unfortunate. The war disrupted this settled narrative not through intention, but through consequence. The structures that had sustained silence weakened under the weight of defeat and change. Records were lost or scattered. People moved, were freed, or died. The plantation system itself fractured, and with it, the certainty that had protected its version of events. It was in this altered landscape that Catherine returned. She did not arrive openly or announce herself. She traveled under a name that had served her for many years, one that had allowed her to live without constant fear. Her appearance at the remnants of the Caldwell estate came quietly, without ceremony. Those who saw her noticed only that she bore a resemblance to someone long absent, a likeness that stirred unease without recognition. Edward Caldwell received her in his study, the same room where he had discovered the wooden box years earlier. The meeting was not recorded formally, but its effect was noted by those nearby. Voices rose and fell behind the closed door. The exchange lasted hours, not because of argument, but because of what could not be said quickly. Catherine did not plead. She stated facts. She named choices. She explained not only what had occurred, but why. Her purpose was limited. She did not seek restoration or forgiveness. She sought acknowledgement and the return of a few personal items that held meaning beyond property. Edward listened, but his response was shaped by years of silence. He understood the truth, but he also understood the cost of its admission. To correct the record would be to dismantle the protection that denial had provided. It would expose not only his brother's household, but the broader complicity of the system they had served. He refused her request. The offer he made instead was transactional, money in exchange for continued silence, distance in place of recognition. It was not framed as threat, but its implications were clear. Catherine accepted neither openly nor angrily. She departed the plantation the following day and did not return. Edward's actions after her departure spoke more clearly than his words. He began to sell portions of the estate, dismantling what remained of its former reach. Within months, he left Georgia altogether. The plantation, once a marker of stability and authority, became an object of quiet embarrassment, then of neglect. The truth did not surface all at once. It emerged in fragments carried by time rather than intention, letters preserved by chance, diaries hidden in walls, records overlooked because they did not fit prevailing narratives. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. The discovery of Catherine's diary provided the first sustained counter-account. Its language was restrained, its observations precise. It did not seek to persuade. It recorded. The injustice described within its pages was not sensational. It was ordinary, structural, and unavoidable. Samuel's journal, found years later, added another dimension. His account did not contradict Catherine. It deepened it. He wrote of preparation and fear, of the cost of leaving others behind, of the persistent anxiety that followed even after escape. His words offered no vindication, only clarity. Church records, census entries, and correspondence filled in what personal writings could not. They traced lives built cautiously, deliberately under assumed names. They showed continuity rather than triumph. Work, children, relocation, the steady labor of remaining free. As scholars assembled these materials, the official narrative began to fracture. The story of abduction no longer held under examination. The symmetry of the relationships, the coordination implied by timing and movement, the absence of evidence supporting violence all pointed elsewhere. Yet even as truth surfaced, it did not fully displace the old account. Institutional denial leaves residue. Communities accustomed to a particular explanation do not abandon it easily. The revised understanding circulated primarily among those who sought it, confined to archives and academic study. For descendants, the truth arrived unevenly. Some learned it late in life. Others never did. The revelation did not offer resolution. It complicated inheritance, forcing a reckoning with both resistance and privilege, with choice made possible by suffering imposed on others. What surfaced was not a story of simple defiance, but of constrained agency exercised under extraordinary pressure. The truth did not redeem the past, it clarified it. By the time these findings coalesced into a coherent account, the Caldwell plantation itself had nearly vanished. Its land repurposed, its structures gone. The silence that had once protected authority now served another function. It marked absence, leaving room for what had been suppressed to be heard, if only faintly. Truth surfaced not as declaration but as accumulation. It did not undo injustice, it named it. And in doing so, it altered how the past could be understood, even if it could not be changed. The aftermath of the Caldwell twins' disappearance did not arrive as a single reckoning. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, across years and generations. There was no moment when the truth replaced the old story entirely. Instead, both accounts persisted, overlapping without reconciliation, each sustained by different needs. In Wilkes County, memory settled into habit. The tale of abduction and presumed death remained the version spoken aloud, repeated without detail, its edges worn smooth by time. It required little thought and asked nothing of those who told it. The plantation itself faded from prominence, its land divided and sold, its buildings dismantled or left to decay. New families arrived who knew nothing of what had occurred there, and those who did know spoke less with each passing year. Edward Caldwell lived out his remaining days in Charleston, removed from the land he had once controlled. He maintained correspondence with family but avoided reference to Georgia. His letters grew shorter over time, their tone restrained. He did not attempt to correct the record, nor did he destroy the evidence he had hidden. His silence was complete, sustained to the end. Catherine returned north and resumed her life under the name she had chosen. She did not speak of her visit south, even within her household. The knowledge she carried remained internal, shaping her days without overt expression. She raised her children carefully, attentive to the boundaries that still existed despite legal change. Her work continued. Her movements remained cautious. Freedom, though secured, was never assumed. Elizabeth's life followed a similar course. Distance provided a measure of safety but not ease. She and Catherine remained in contact, their correspondence steady and measured. They did not dwell on the past in their letters. What mattered had already been decided. What remained was endurance. For Samuel and Elijah, the aftermath was marked by labor and vigilance. They built livelihoods where they could, moving when necessary, adjusting to shifting conditions. The end of slavery removed the threat of legal capture, but not the weight of history. They did not seek recognition or redress. Their resistance had never been oriented toward reward. When Samuel died, his passing was recorded without reference to the life he had lived before freedom. The document listed occupation, residence, age. It did not name the years spent in bondage, nor the decision that had altered its course. Catherine accepted this without protest. The record reflected the world as it was, not as it ought to be. Elizabeth lived longer, long enough to see her grandchildren grow. In her later years, she spoke occasionally of Georgia, but always in general terms. She did not correct assumptions. Silence had become a form of protection, and she had learned its discipline well. The surfacing of documents decades later did not change their lives. It changed understanding. Scholars assembled fragments into narratives, careful not to impose coherence where none had existed. The story that emerged was incomplete by necessity. Gaps remained. Motivations could be inferred but not proven. Silence, once imposed, had lasting effect. Descendants encountered this history unevenly. Some received it as burden, others as source of pride. Most experienced it as complication. The Caldwell twins could not be easily categorized as victims or heroes. They had benefited from a system they ultimately rejected. Their choices disrupted injustice, but did not dismantle it. The enslaved men with whom they fled gained freedom, but left others behind. The historical marker placed near the former plantation site reflected this ambivalence. Its language was brief, cautious. It named the family, the land, the period. It omitted the event that had once drawn attention. This omission was not accidental. It represented the persistence of discomfort, the reluctance to acknowledge a story that resisted simple framing. What remained, finally, was not resolution, but record. Diaries, letters, and official documents preserved a version of events that could not be entirely suppressed. They testified to constrained choices made under pressure, to injustice confronted without spectacle, to resistance enacted quietly and at great cost. The Caldwell twins did not seek to be remembered. They sought to live according to a truth they could no longer deny. The aftermath of that decision extended beyond their lifetimes, shaping how their story would be told, obscured, recovered, and reconsidered. In the end, the plantation vanished, the fields changed, the names faded from common use. What endured was the question their lives posed, not loudly, but persistently. What does it mean to refuse an unjust order when refusal carries consequences not only for oneself, but for others? There was no answer offered, only an account. History did not redeem them, nor did it condemn them fully. It recorded what could be known and left the rest to silence. In that silence, the weight of their choice remains, uncelebrated and unresolved, a reminder that the past is shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was declared.